It's been a busy week for world leaders as a host of high-stakes meetings took place in Indonesia and India, involving Southeast Asian nations and other key regional players. South Korean President Yoon was no exception. For a wrap-up of his packed diplomatic schedule and what it means for Korea's diplomacy, I'm joined by Principal Researcher Kim Yang-gyu from the East Asia Institute. Dr. Kim, thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Overall, how do you assess what was discussed at this year's Group of 20 Economies meeting?
I think I have to say it was a pretty successful one, and India did an excellent job in organizing this event, I guess, and especially because of, as you just mentioned, like the successful adoption of the leaders' declaration. A lot of people worry about this summit, particularly because of the absence of President Xi Jinping and President Biden at the same time. And
also, not President Biden.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, President Putin,
yes.
sorry, President Putin and President Xi Jinping. And a lot of concerns over that this because of this clear cleavage between the Western countries and the authoritarian regimes like Russia and China, and would be able to produce any productive outcomes, especially because we had never had any single communique during the ministerial meetings during the India's G20 presidency this year so far. So this is pretty amazing, I think. And I think this is because of this result of 200 hours of ruthless negotiations, of course. And I think that deserves some recognition. And not only they managed to have this statement, but also they covered a lot of important issues like climate financing, global debt, and reforms of institutions like the World Bank. And also the African Union is officially joined G20, invited by India. So I think Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi should be proud of it, and also it's going to help him a little bit in next election. But also it's going to be a pleasant news for Washington as well, because as National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan repeatedly mentioned before his travel to New Delhi, that, here I quote, the U.S. has a deep stake in stewarding the G20 and ensuring that it remains a central mechanism for global coordination on all the major challenges we face. And Washington committed to host the G20 in 2026. So the success of the G20 this year is going to be a good news for Washington as well.
Mm-hmm. And addressing the G20 leaders, South Korean President Yoon vowed to expand Korea's contributions to the climate, Green Climate Fund and Ukraine. Where does that leave Korea on the global stage?
Yeah, right. The Principal Deputy National Security Advisor Kim Yeol mentioned that during the press briefing on September 9th, the G20 Summit will be a showcase for South Korea to extend its role beyond even Indo-Pacific to address global agenda. And the Senior Presidential Secretary for Economic Affairs, Choi Sang-mok, also emphasized that Korea did not have to contribute this money because it already made a contribution twice, $100 million in 2013 and $200 million during the 2020 to 2023 fundraising period. So this additional $300 million to Green Climate Fund, the GCF, is going to be well received by other countries. And in addition, Yoon also pledged to support developing countries to their green transition through knowledge sharing, and also Korea is going to play the role of green ladder to assist nations vulnerable to climate change. And also he presented a vision of green shipping corridor, which is going to use development of the low carbon or carbon-free vessels, as well as the environmentally friendly port infrastructure. And considering this, sustainable growth is everybody's problem. And South Korea's commitment to this global issue is going to elevate South Korea's status in the global politics for sure, especially like, for example, China always tried to link their commitment to this global climate change issues with their national interests, such as, like, for example, like U.S.-China climate change cooperation can only be possible when there is a healthy development of relations between the U.S. and China, and that's prevented because U.S. is now holding the strategy or policy of small yard and high fence, is trying to prevent China's investment in semiconductor and artificial intelligence and quantum computing. So even China is trying to connect the national interest with this global issue. And South Korea is actually playing a leadership role in here. which is going to be very helpful for South Korea's future foreign policy.
All right. And Dr. Kim, President Yoon holds an array of bilateral talks with middle and emerging powers, including India and MITKA. So in what way do they carry significance for this nation?
I remember the presidential office mentioned the MITKA meeting along with other G20 Summit that President Yoon is going to have for the Busan's bid for the 2030 World Expo. And of course, the Expo is an important issue. But I think a lot more is at stake in coordination with these MITKA countries, because I think it's inevitable for South Korea to strengthen the relationship cooperation with the United States and also the Global Alliance Network US is now formulating. It's essential. We have to join them. But at the same time, we have to send the message that South Korea is not supporting everything that Washington does. What we are trying to do is trying to establish a global governance based on principle that agreed by all countries, like based on universal value, for instance. So we could always talk about the freedom of choice, like respect for everybody's core interests, respect for international institutions like UN, or freedom of navigation and so on, to show that this is about a principle, not about ideology. So South Korea has to demonstrate that it's a two pillar of foreign policy. We have a strengthened cooperation with the U.S. as an important ally, but also we are going to have this idea that we are going to establish a global norms and that could even binding United States. And MITKA is very important, the group of countries that we can cooperate with in establishing this rules-based order.
And Doctor, let's now talk about the ASEAN-related summits. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is likely to travel to Russia to meet President Putin and discuss arms deal. President Yoon at the ASEAN Summit warned against any attempt to add military cooperation with the regime. And so what do you read into a message? And before I let you go, some say President Yoon maintained critical tone on Russia for this alleged arms cooperation, while at the same time, he adopted a softer tone towards China, hoping for cooperation on North Korea as President Yoon met Chinese Premier Li Qiang. What's your view?
Well, a lot to cover. Okay. So first, I have to say that this is happening because nobody was prepared for this largest conventional war since the World War II, and everybody engaged in this war is experiencing the shortage of ammunition. Even if you have weapons, you cannot sustain war if you don't have ammunition, right? And the only part of the world that have a large stockpile of ammunition is Korean Peninsula, because we are still under armistice, and both South and North Korea has substantial reserves. And that's why Russia needs support from North Korea. But what's interesting thing is that as Sullivan, National Security Advisor Sullivan mentioned, that even though the cooperation between the two countries are fastly advancing, North Korea has yet provided a substantial amount of munitions or military support to Moscow. So that means that we still have opportunity to stop that. That's why we have to send a strong message warning against it. That's why I think President Yoon mentioned it. And also, like, the reason why the South Korea has to have some carefully chosen path towards China is because China is reacting strangely these days, because I see that there is a shift in tone in the bilateral relations. Like, since when there is a criticism from Ambassador Shin Hai-ming, it upset a lot of members, the government officials in the Yoon government, and a lot of people speculated that after this Camp David trilateral meeting, Beijing is going to criticize Seoul heavily. But very interestingly, Beijing did not attack South Korea directly, and there was even a constructive dialogue between Foreign Minister Park Jin and his counterpart Wang Yi over telephone last week, and Foreign Minister Wang Yi said, here I quote, that China has very clear intention to develop the relationship between the two countries, and it's kind of natural. And Park Jin also replied that it is impossible and infeasible for us to cutting China off from the supply chain. So we see that China is kind of playing some kind of pulling and pushing game, like 밀당 in Korean. So like China is now engaging South Korea heavily, and we saw that Lee Chang and meeting between Premier Lee Chang and the President Yoon Sung-yeol again, and they talk about a lot of issues, and again they cover a lot of extensive issues that the both countries can cooperate with each other, like free trade, supply chain, and cooperation in the cutting edge technologies. So as Beijing is engaging with Seoul now, I think we have to pull China this time for some time, and let's see how it goes from here.
Interesting. All right, Dr. Kim, we appreciate your insights.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.